The iron shackles cut into her wrists, but Harriet Tubman's eyes burned with a fire that no chain could contain. It was 1849, and she stood at a crossroads that would define not only her life, but the lives of hundreds who would follow her to freedom. In her heart, she heard a voice as clear as thunder. "Go forward, I will be with you." This wasn't just courage speaking. This was faith, the kind of faith that transforms the oppressed into liberators, that turns whispered prayers in the darkness into anthems of revolution, that makes history bow to the will of those deemed powerless. Tonight we tell the story of how one woman's unshakable belief in divine purpose shattered the chains of slavery and lit a path to freedom that would change a nation forever. To understand the magnitude of what Harriet Tubman accomplished, we must first grasp the absolute horror of the system she was born into. The transatlantic slave trade, spanning more than 4 centuries, forcibly displaced an estimated 12 million Africans, with nearly 2 million dying during the brutal Middle Passage across the Atlantic. By the early 19th century, when Harriet was born around 1822 in Dorchester County, Maryland, slavery had become the economic foundation of the American South. Cotton was king, and enslaved people were the machinery that powered this kingdom of cruelty. They were considered property, listed in estate inventories alongside livestock and furniture, bought and sold at auction blocks where families were torn apart without hesitation or mercy. The legal framework supporting slavery was comprehensive and crushing. Enslaved people had no legal rights, could not testify in court, could not own property, could not marry legally, and could not learn to read or write in most slave states. The punishment for resistance ranged from brutal whippings to mutilation to death. Slave patrols roamed the countryside, authorized to stop, search, and punish any person of African descent found without proper documentation. The entire system was designed to break the human spirit, to create a permanent underclass that would accept their bondage as natural and inevitable. But the architects of this system made one critical miscalculation. They underestimated the power of faith to sustain hope in the most hopeless circumstances. Harriet Tubman was born Araminta Ross, called Minty by her family, to enslaved parents Harriet Green and Ben Ross on a plantation owned by Edward Brodess. From her earliest memories, she knew nothing but hard labor and cruelty. At age 5, she was rented out to a woman who beat her daily, leaving scars that would mark her body for life. At age 7, she was sent to check muskrat traps in icy marshes, work that left her sick for months. As a young teenager, she suffered a traumatic head injury when an overseer threw a 2-pound weight at another enslaved person and hit Harriet instead. The injury caused her to suffer from seizures, severe headaches, and narcoleptic episodes for the rest of her life. But it was during these seizures and vivid dreams that Harriet began to experience what she described as visions from God, spiritual experiences that would guide her life's mission. If this story of faith, courage, and liberation is moving you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, hit the like button, and share this video with others. Your support helps us continue bringing these powerful historical stories to light. Harriet's faith was rooted in the Christianity she learned from her parents, but it was a very different Christianity from what the slaveholders preached. Slave owners carefully selected Bible verses that emphasized obedience to masters, preaching that slavery was ordained by God and that enslaved people should accept their lot in this life for rewards in the next. But in the secret meetings held in the woods after dark, away from the master's watchful eyes, enslaved people practiced a different faith. They sang spirituals that contained coded messages about escape routes. They preached about Moses leading his people out of Egypt, about Daniel in the lion's den, about the walls of Jericho falling down. They created a theology of liberation that insisted God was on the side of the oppressed, that deliverance was not just a heavenly promise, but an earthly imperative. For Harriet, faith was not passive acceptance, but active resistance. She later recalled that from her teenage years, she would pray constantly, "Lord, if you ain't never going to change that man's heart, kill him, Lord, and take him out of the way." She was referring to her owner, whose cruelty was legendary. When he died suddenly, she was initially filled with guilt, believing her prayers had caused his death, but she came to see it as divine intervention, removing an obstacle to her freedom. This interpretation of faith as a force that actively intervenes in human affairs, that takes sides in struggles for justice, became the theological foundation for her life's work. The turning point came in 1849, when Harriet learned that she and several family members were going to be sold further south, a fate that would separate her from her husband, John Tubman, a free black man she had married 5 years earlier, and likely condemn her to even harsher conditions on a deep South plantation. She made a decision that required extraordinary courage. She would escape. When she approached her husband about fleeing together, he refused and even threatened to report her plans. Devastated but undeterred, Harriet turned to her faith. She prayed for guidance, and in her visions she saw a line stretching northward, and she heard a voice telling her to follow. With no map, little food, and only her faith as a compass, Harriet Tubman began her journey to freedom. She traveled at night, following the North Star, hiding in swamps and forests during the day. The journey of nearly 90 miles from Maryland to Pennsylvania was fraught with danger. Slave catchers with dogs patrolled the roads, and any white person could demand papers from any black person they encountered. Harriet later described feeling the presence of God guiding her every step, warning her of danger, showing her safe places to hide. After weeks of terrifying travel, she crossed into Pennsylvania, a free state, and later recalled that moment. "I looked at my hands to see if I was the same person. There was such a glory over everything. The sun came like gold through the trees and over the fields, and I felt like I was in heaven. But freedom brought an unexpected emptiness." Harriet was alone in a strange place, separated from everyone she loved who remained in bondage. This is when her mission crystallized. She would not simply enjoy her own freedom while her family and people remained enslaved. She would return to the land of slavery and lead others to freedom, no matter the risk to herself. When friends warned her of the danger, of the likelihood of capture and severe punishment or death, she responded with words that revealed the depth of her faith. "I can't die but once." She believed that God had brought her out of slavery for a purpose, and that purpose was to be a liberator of her people, a Moses figure leading them out of bondage. Between 1850 and 1860, Harriet Tubman made an estimated 13 trips back into slave territory, personally leading approximately 70 enslaved people to freedom, including her elderly parents. She became the most famous conductor on the Underground Railroad, the secret network of safe houses and routes that helped enslaved people escape to free states and Canada. Slave owners in Maryland posted a reward of $40,000 for her capture, an enormous sum that testified to how much she threatened the institution of slavery. Yet she was never caught, and she never lost a passenger, a record she attributed entirely to divine guidance. She carried a pistol, not to fight slave catchers, which would have been futile, but to discourage any of her passengers from turning back when fear overwhelmed them, as going back would endanger everyone involved. She would tell frightened escapees, "You'll be free or die." Harriet's method combined careful planning with absolute faith. She typically began her rescue missions on Saturday nights, giving her group a full day's head start before the escape would be noticed on Monday morning. She used the network of safe houses maintained by abolitionists, both black and white, who risked severe penalties for harboring fugitives. She employed disguises, sometimes dressing as a man, other times as an old woman. She memorized the back roads and swamps of the Eastern Shore, But beyond all these practical precautions, she relied on what she called conversations with God. She would enter into periods of deep prayer, and from these prayers she claimed to receive specific instructions about when to move, which path to take, where danger lay. Her faith was tested repeatedly. Once, while hiding in a potato hole with a group of fugitives, they heard slave catchers with dogs approaching. The group was terrified, certain they would be discovered. Harriet closed her eyes and prayed silently but fervently. Later she reported that she received a vision showing her that the pursuers would turn back, and she calmly told her frightened companions to remain still and quiet. Against all odds, the slave catchers and their dogs passed within feet of their hiding place, but did not detect them. Harriet attributed this and countless similar narrow escapes to divine protection, and her passengers came to believe it too. Stories of Harriet's seemingly miraculous ability to evade capture spread through enslaved communities, and she became a figure of legend, known as Moses, long before the Civil War ended. The role of faith in sustaining enslaved people extended far beyond Harriet's individual story. Throughout the South, religion provided the spiritual and psychological resources to endure unendurable conditions. Enslaved people transformed Christianity into a religion of resistance and hope. The spirituals they sang contained multiple layers of meaning. Amazing Grace was not just about individual salvation, but about collective deliverance. Swing Low, Sweet Chariot was code for the Underground Railroad coming to carry people to freedom. Wade in the Water contained practical instructions for escaping detection by slave-catching dogs, whose sense of smell would be confused by water. Go Down Moses explicitly compared American slavery to Egyptian bondage and called for a liberator to arise. Religious gatherings, even when permitted or supervised by owners, became spaces of cultural preservation and resistance. Enslaved people maintained African religious practices blended with Christianity, creating unique forms of worship involving call and response, spirit possession, and ring shouts. These practices affirmed their humanity and dignity in a system designed to deny both. The black church that emerged from slavery would become the institutional backbone of every subsequent civil rights movement, from Reconstruction through the 20th century struggles. The faith forged in the fires of slavery was not an opiate dulling pain, but a weapon of resistance and a blueprint for liberation. Harriet's faith also sustained her through personal losses and disappointments. Her husband, John Tubman, had remarried during her absence, and when she returned to Maryland to rescue him, he refused to come, having built a new life with another woman. Harriet was heartbroken but redirected her energy toward freeing others. She never remarried until after the Civil War, dedicating her prime years entirely to the liberation struggle. Her visions and seizures, which resulted from her childhood head injury, could have been debilitating, but she interpreted them as spiritual gifts, moments when God spoke directly to her. Modern neurologists might diagnose her condition as temporal lobe epilepsy, but the effect was the same. Harriet experienced transcendent states that she understood as divine communication, and these experiences gave her unshakable confidence in her mission. The incredible courage displayed by this woman and countless others who fought for freedom deserves to be remembered and shared. If you're inspired by this story, please hit that subscribe button, give us a like, and share this video to help spread these important lessons from history. The outbreak of the Civil War in 1861 transformed the context of Harriet's work. She immediately recognized the war as divine judgment on America for the sin of slavery. She joined the Union cause, serving first as a nurse, then as a scout and spy. Her knowledge of the Southern terrain and her ability to move undetected made her invaluable to Union military operations. In 1863, she became the first woman to lead an armed assault during the Civil War, guiding Colonel James Montgomery and his regiment up the Combahee River in South Carolina, where they destroyed Confederate supply lines and liberated more than 700 enslaved people. The raid was a tactical and symbolic victory, demonstrating that enslaved people would fight for their own freedom when given the opportunity. Throughout the war, Harriet continued to attribute her successes to divine guidance. She told fellow soldiers and officers that she received visions showing her where Confederate troops were positioned, which routes were safe, where supplies were hidden. Whether these visions were spiritual revelations, the result of her neurological condition, or simply intuitive insights born of her years navigating dangerous territory, they proved remarkably accurate. Her reputation for supernatural guidance made her a revered figure among the soldiers she served with, both black and white. They saw in her something that transcended ordinary human capability, a connection to power beyond the material world. The Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 and the eventual Union victory in 1865 brought legal freedom to nearly 4 million enslaved people. But Harriet understood that the struggle was far from over. Freedom without resources, without land, without education, without political rights, was incomplete freedom. She spent her post-war years advocating for the rights of freed people and for women's suffrage, making the connection between different forms of oppression. She worked with Susan B. Anthony and other suffragists, arguing that just as slavery had been a sin against God's creation, so was the denial of women's equality. Her faith consistently pushed her toward an expansive vision of justice that encompassed all forms of human liberation. In her later years, Harriet lived in Auburn, New York, on property she had purchased through her own earnings and donations from supporters. She established the Harriet Tubman Home for Aged and Indigent Negroes, providing care for elderly black people who had nowhere else to go. Even in old age, disabled by her war injuries and her lifelong seizures, she continued to embody the faith that had driven her entire life. She regularly spoke at churches and gatherings, sharing her story and emphasizing that everything she had accomplished was through God's power, not her own. She rejected any credit for herself, insisting she was merely an instrument of divine will. Harriet's theology was simple but profound. She believed in a God who takes sides, who actively intervenes in history on behalf of the oppressed, who gives people the courage and guidance to participate in their own liberation. This was a radical departure from the Christianity that slaveholders preached, which emphasized obedience, patience, and rewards in the afterlife. Harriet's faith was earthly and urgent. She prayed for specific practical things: safe passage on a particular night, the changing of a guard's routine, a fog to provide cover, the sympathy of a stranger who might offer shelter. And she believed her prayers were answered in tangible ways that allowed her mission to succeed. The historical impact of Harriet Tubman and others like her who combined faith with action cannot be overstated. Frederick Douglass, himself an escaped slave who became a leading abolitionist, wrote to Harriet in 1868, "The midnight sky and the silent stars have been the witnesses of your devotion to freedom and of your heroism." He acknowledged that while his work had been public and celebrated, hers had been secret and far more dangerous. The Underground Railroad, operated primarily by black activists like Harriet, with support from white abolitionists, helped thousands escape slavery. But more importantly, it demonstrated that enslaved people were not passive victims, but active agents of their own liberation. The faith traditions developed during slavery directly influenced the civil rights movement of the 20th century. Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., Reverend Ralph Abernathy, Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth, and countless other civil rights leaders were ministers who drew on the theological tradition of liberation that Harriet and her generation had forged. The Montgomery bus boycott, the sit-ins, the freedom rides, the March on Washington, all were organized through black churches and sustained by faith that God was on the side of justice. The spirituals that enslaved people had sung became freedom songs. The Underground Railroad became a metaphor for the networks that smuggled civil rights workers through hostile territory. Harriet herself became an icon and inspiration, her image appearing on posters and her story told to motivate new generations of activists. The role of women in these liberation movements, often hidden or minimized, was central. Harriet worked alongside other remarkable women like Sojourner Truth, who combined abolition and women's rights advocacy, and Harriet Jacobs, who wrote about her experiences in slavery and subsequent escape. These women operated in a society that denied them rights on multiple fronts, as black people, as women, as former slaves. Yet their faith gave them a platform for authority. They could claim to speak with divine authorization, which allowed them to challenge both racial and gender hierarchies. The black church, despite its own patriarchal tendencies, provided space for women's leadership in ways that few other institutions did. Harriet's life also reveals the complex relationship between violence and faith in liberation struggles. She was deeply religious, praying constantly, attributing everything to God, yet she carried a gun and was prepared to use it. She participated in military raids that killed Confederate soldiers. This combination troubles those who want to separate faith from force, but it reflects the reality that oppressed people face. Sometimes survival and liberation require both spiritual strength and physical resistance. Harriet never saw a contradiction. She believed God had called her to fight slavery by any means necessary, and if that included violence against those who perpetuated violence, so be it. The spirituals and religious practices of enslaved people have been preserved and studied, giving us insight into their faith and resistance. Songs like Go Down Moses explicitly identified with biblical liberation narratives. Steal Away to Jesus was code for secret meetings or escape attempts. Many Thousand Gone celebrated those who had escaped or died free. These songs were theological statements asserting that God desired freedom for all people, that slavery was contrary to divine will, and that resistance was holy work. They maintained African musical traditions while incorporating Christian themes, creating a unique African-American sacred music tradition that would eventually give rise to gospel, blues, and jazz. The theology of liberation that emerged from the black experience of slavery has influenced Christian thinking worldwide. Liberation theology in Latin America, Minjung theology in Korea, and Dalit theology in India all draw on similar themes. God's preferential option for the poor and oppressed, the sinfulness of unjust social structures, the calling of believers to work for justice in this world rather than simply waiting for the next. The faith of Harriet Tubman and her contemporaries demonstrated that Christianity could be a revolutionary force rather than merely a tool of social control, a lesson that has resonated far beyond the American context. Harriet's final years were spent in relative poverty despite her service to the nation. The federal government denied her proper compensation for her military service for decades. She survived on small payments, donations from supporters, and eventually a veteran's pension after years of advocacy. She remained active in her church and community until her death in 1913 at approximately 91 years old. Her funeral was held with military honors, a fitting recognition for someone who had been a warrior for freedom. Her last words were reported to be a spiritual call and response. I go to prepare a place for you. Even in death, Harriet's faith sustained her, as it had throughout her extraordinary life. The legacy Harriet left goes beyond the specific individuals she rescued or the military operations she supported. She proved that faith combined with courage could accomplish what seemed impossible. She demonstrated that the most marginalized people in society, a poor, disabled black woman in 19th century America, could change history through determination and spiritual conviction. She showed that liberation is not something granted from above, but something achieved through struggle, and that spiritual resources can sustain people through even the most dangerous and difficult struggles. Today, Harriet Tubman is recognized as an American hero, her image selected to appear on the $20 bill, though that change has been delayed. Numerous schools, organizations, and monuments bear her name. Her story is taught in schools as an example of courage and determination. But we must be careful not to sanitize or simplify her story. She was not merely brave, she was strategic. She was not merely faithful, she was militant. She did not simply oppose slavery, she actively dismantled it one rescue at a time. And her faith was not otherworldly escapism, but a this-worldly force for radical change. The question her life poses to us is what role faith should play in contemporary struggles for justice. In an increasingly secular age, the language of divine guidance and supernatural intervention can seem antiquated or irrelevant. Yet for millions of people around the world who face oppression, faith remains a vital resource for hope, courage, and community. The Black Lives Matter movement has deep connections to the Black church tradition. Immigration activists often draw on religious language and church support. Environmental justice advocates speak of creation care and stewardship. The question is not whether faith matters, but how it matters, whether it becomes a force for liberation or for maintaining injustice. Harriet's life suggests that liberating faith has certain characteristics. It takes sides with the oppressed against oppressors. It demands action, not just contemplation. It provides courage to take enormous risks. It builds community and mutual support. It combines spiritual practice with practical organizing. It refuses to accept injustice as inevitable or divinely ordained. It interprets sacred texts and traditions through the lens of liberation rather than domination. It sustains people through long struggles without quick victories. And it maintains hope even when circumstances seem hopeless. As we conclude this powerful story of faith and freedom, we invite you to subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it with others who need to hear this message. These stories of courage and liberation need to be told and retold, generation after generation. The story of Harriet Tubman and liberation through faith teaches us that no system of oppression, no matter how powerful or entrenched, is permanent. Every empire that claimed to last forever has fallen. Every form of bondage that claimed divine sanction has eventually been broken. And the agents of that breaking have often been those who had the least power by worldly standards, but who possessed an unshakable faith that another world was possible, and a determination to bring it into being through whatever means necessary. Harriet's faith was not naive or simplistic. She had seen the worst of human cruelty. She bore in her body the scars of violence. She lived with the trauma of childhood abuse and a debilitating injury. She knew that slaveholders used religion to justify their crimes. She could easily have rejected faith entirely. Instead, she claimed faith for herself and her people, reinterpreting it as a force for liberation. She refused to let the powerful monopolize religious authority or define what God wanted. She asserted that her visions and prayers were as valid as any preacher's sermons, that God spoke to an illiterate black woman in the swamps of Maryland as clearly as to any theologian in a university. This democratization of religious authority was itself revolutionary. Throughout history, religious institutions have been dominated by elites who used their positions to legitimize social hierarchies. But in the enslaved community, and particularly in the experiences of people like Harriet, faith became unmediated and direct. You didn't need a master's permission to pray. You didn't need education to read Bible stories you learned orally. You didn't need institutional approval to claim divine guidance. This direct access to spiritual power provided a foundation for asserting human dignity and worth that no earthly authority could grant or take away. The practical effects of faith on Harriet's life were clear. It gave her courage to attempt escapes that most people considered suicidal. It provided interpretive frameworks for understanding her seizures and visions as gifts rather than disabilities. It connected her to a community of believers who supported the Underground Railroad. It offered language and symbols that communicated across the divides of literacy and education. It sustained hope during her years of dangerous, exhausting, seemingly endless work, and it gave her a sense of purpose and meaning that transcended personal survival or comfort. But faith alone was not enough. Harriet combined faith with careful planning, physical courage, practical skills, knowledge of terrain and weather, ability to read people and situations, willingness to use force when necessary, and coordination with a network of activists. The lesson is not that faith magically solves problems, but that faith can provide the spiritual resources that enable people to do the hard work of liberation. It's the combination of spiritual conviction and practical action that creates change. The abolition of slavery did not happen because slaveholders suddenly developed consciences. It happened because enslaved people resisted in countless ways, from day-to-day acts of defiance to organized rebellions to mass escapes. It happened because abolitionists, black and white, built movements that changed public opinion and political calculations. It happened because economic forces made slavery less profitable in some regions. It happened because the Civil War destroyed the political and military power that protected slavery. And it happened because people like Harriet Tubman refused to accept that the way things were was the way things had to be. The faith that sustained this resistance was not passive acceptance of suffering. It was active, militant, insistent faith that God desired freedom and justice, that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice, as Dr. King would later say, but only because people of faith put their bodies on the line to bend it. This is the faith that built the Underground Railroad, that sustained the civil rights movement, that continues to animate struggles for justice today. It's faith that comforts the afflicted and afflicts the comfortable. Faith that sustains the long march toward freedom. Harriet Tubman died in 1913, 50 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, having lived to see slavery abolished, but also seeing the rise of Jim Crow segregation, lynching, and new forms of racial oppression. Liberation is never complete or final. Each generation must fight its own battles. But Harriet left a roadmap. Combine faith with action, never give up, help others to freedom, trust in divine guidance while also using every human resource available, and refuse to accept injustice as normal or inevitable. Her life stands as a testament to what one person can accomplish when faith meets courage. She couldn't read or write, but she outwitted slave catchers and military officers. She had no money or institutional power, but she commanded respect from generals and senators. She was marginalized by race, gender, disability, and poverty, but she became one of the most consequential Americans of the 19th century. Her weapon was not superior force, but superior faith. The absolute conviction that God was on the side of the oppressed and that she was called to be an instrument of liberation. In our own time, when many feel powerless in the face of systemic injustice, when the problems seem too big and the forces arrayed against change too powerful, the story of Harriet Tubman offers both inspiration and instruction. Change is possible. The powerful can be defeated. Freedom can be won. But it requires faith, not faith as wishful thinking or passive hope, but faith as radical conviction that animates revolutionary action. It requires courage to take the first step into darkness, trusting that light will be provided. It requires perseverance through setbacks and dangers. It requires community and solidarity, and it requires a willingness to risk everything for the possibility of freedom. Harriet Tubman's liberation through faith was not just her personal journey from slavery to freedom, though it was that. It was her transformation from fugitive to liberator, from one who escaped to one who returned again and again to lead others out. It was her refusal to be satisfied with individual freedom while others remained in bondage. It was her commitment to a collective liberation that would free not just individuals, but a people, that would strike at the foundations of an evil system rather than merely helping people cope with it. This is the faith that makes history, the faith that overthrows oppression, the faith that insists another world is not only possible but necessary, and that we are called to bring it into being. As we reflect on this remarkable life and legacy, we are left with questions for our own time. What forms of oppression exist today that seem as permanent and unshakable as slavery seemed in 1849? Who are the Harriet Tubmans of our time, the people written off as powerless who are nevertheless fighting for liberation? What role does faith play in contemporary movements for justice? How do we sustain hope and courage for struggles that may take generations to win? How do we combine spiritual resources with practical organizing? And how do we ensure that liberation, when it comes, is real and lasting rather than merely changing the form of oppression? Harriet Tubman cannot answer these questions for us. Each generation must find its own path. But her life provides a model, faith combined with action, spiritual conviction translated into earthly struggle, divine guidance expressed through human courage, liberation achieved not from above but from below, by the people who need it most, with help from allies but under their own leadership, and according to their own understanding of what freedom means. This is the faith that liberated Harriet Tubman. This is the faith that she used to liberate hundreds of others. This is the faith that continues to inspire liberation struggles around the world. And this is the faith that, if we have courage to embrace it, can still make history today.